Hello. Sailing to Byzantium is the evocative title of a beautiful poem by William Butler Yeats. In that poem, he describes the search for a lost city, a lost realm of gold, a place where the young are in each other's arms, no country for old men. That Byzantium has vanished from the earth with the end of the Byzantine Empire in the 15th century. But some lonely outposts of Byzantium still live on, carrying the spirit into our own time. And we, together, are going to go in quest of a few of them. Let's go by ship or by boat across the green-blue Aegean Sea, coming up on an extraordinary mass of rock that juts out from the eastern coast of the Peloponnese in Greece as Gibraltar juts out from the coast of Spain. We are looking at Μονεμβασια, an outpost of that old Byzantine Empire that is still inhabited and that is actually very little changed from what it was in the days when it was ruled by the Byzantine emperors. This ghost town still has living in it a determined few people who want to keep μονεμβασια a place where one can go, one can leave the modern world behind, enter into its narrow streets, and immerse oneself in the colorful past. We will take our boat up to a little stone wharf leading up to a gate, beautifully arched in the stone wall. That is the Portello, the old water gate of the city of μονεμβασια. As we enter into that gate, we find ourselves in a maze of tiny streets and lanes, so narrow that if another person approaches, we must turn sideways to let them pass. We find streets suddenly giving up the fight with the slope and becoming little steps. And then as we emerge into a tiny square, all around us are the buildings of the Byzantine Empire. We are in a great trading center, a great city of commerce and life that was originally founded in 581 AD by Greeks fleeing unsettled conditions on the mainland of the Peloponnese to come out to this semi-island, this vast rock sort of moored at the edge of the land, which from time to time would have a tiny spit of land connecting it with the mainland, and at other times was actually cut off at an island. We know the ancient name of this rock, Minoa, named after King Minos of Crete, and probably even in the most ancient times, a trading colony of a faraway power. Here at μονεμβασια, the name means one way in, referring to that little spit of land back to the mainland of the Peloponnese. We find that the surrounding walls of the Byzantine fortifications enclose within them a slice of history, a place where the patterns of life and the architecture of that long-lost Byzantine world are still all around us, in private houses, in churches, and in fortifications. All we're missing is that throb of mercantile, profit-making commerce that brought the ships of the Mediterranean to this port and made this today quiet and lonely place, at one time, the chief naval base in the Aegean Sea of the Byzantine emperors. After we've explored the lower town, which we are going to come back to, we begin to walk up a precipitous flight of steps. It seems to be initially just a passageway rising along the rock between some ordinary houses. But gradually it develops into a switchback trail up a precipice with parapets to make sure that we do not plunge to our deaths in the town below. We pass under archways, gates, see old wooden doors which appear from their battered nature to go all the way back to that lost Byzantine Empire. And at last we emerge onto the summit, sun-baked, treeless, surrounded by scrub and thorns and the tiny flowers of the Mediterranean islands. We've reached the top of μονεμβασια, Up above us are the ruined walls of the great Byzantine citadel that protected this place. But over on the other side, a little bit more of a climb away, we see a Byzantine church. This is a church called Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom. But it's not the great church, so famous, that stands in Byzantium, Istanbul. It is, on the contrary, a bastion of that Greek Orthodox faith of which Byzantium was the heart. This Hagia Sophia was created in the 12th century AD. As we approach it, it seems to be a miracle, hanging almost in space, sheer drops down to the sea below, a church clinging to its existence on the edge of this great rock of Μονεμβασια. As you look at this lonely church, you are seeing all of the special hallmarks that set Byzantine architecture apart from the earlier architecture, much better known, of the classical Greeks and Romans. The Greeks and Romans loved an architecture of light and openness, facades of white marble gleaming in the sun, often brightly painted so that they have an exuberance and color that has been lost today. Rows of columns with the sun coming in behind them into the porticos, high gables, elaborate sculpture on the outside of every major building so that they become art galleries speaking to the visitor from the outside. This Byzantine church is nothing like that. Here we see an architecture that is enclosed. The surfaces of the buildings are plain. They are almost always marked by brick architecture, something that the Greeks ignored altogether and the Romans considered very humdrum, something to be covered up with elaborate plaster. But the Byzantines are proud of their brick, and they will often mix it with stone to create a very homespun but very solid-looking mass of masonry and brick, rising to a dome at the top, a tiled roof, with tiny windows to let in a bare minimum of light, those windows almost always with little round arched tops. It seems to be a kind of architecture that wants to deny every value of the classical world, and in truth, that is what it was. Because the Christians who worshipped in these churches, and it is indeed churches that are the main focus of Byzantine architects, they had created a new world, an interior world of the spirit, very different from the public display of Greco-Roman religious activities, and also a world in which communities of people met inside these churches in large numbers and wanted to feel that they were in a different world, that they had been transported simply by entering the church to a different place. Let us go into this magical Byzantine church, perched high on the rock at Μονεμβασια, and experience that for ourselves. As we walk into the door out of the glaring sunshine on the top of the rock, we feel immediately we need to adjust our eyes for the dimness, the shadows of this interior. Around us are the traces of ancient frescoes that were once painted on these walls. But this church, like so many Byzantine churches, has been battered by time. It has been taken over and used at times as a monastery by those of the Latin faith, or as a mosque by those of the Islamic tradition. The beautiful frescoes that once adorned the dome over our heads are gone. But as we move into the center of the church and look up, even here in this small church, perched on the edge of a precipice, we have that same soul-lifting, heart-expanding experience that we will feel under the dome of Hagia Sophia, the great church in Istanbul. We feel that we cannot understand what holds that dome up. It seems a miracle. It seems a little mirror of the heavens beyond. That's what those Byzantines wanted. The transport of a person inside the building, surrounded by other worshipers in a communal feeling of elevation. And even in this tiny, silent place, perched on the edge of nowhere, I believe you will feel it very strongly. This is an important part of the magic of Μονεμβασια. After we have explored the summit, we make our way down again along the switchback trail and immerse ourselves in the town. I hope you will join me at a table and order some Malvasia wine. The Venetians who came here to trade or to view it as a rival place that they wanted to eventually take over, those Venetians couldn't somehow wrap their tongues around monεμβασια, so they called the place Malvasia. And the wine that they bought here, made from a lovely white grape that yielded a very sweet wine, they carried it back home and said it was wine of Malvasia. They carried the grapes eventually and the tradition westward into the Mediterranean, as far as Portugal, and then the Portuguese carried it on out into the islands of the Atlantic and planted those same white grapes, which originated here in this spot, all the way out on the island of Madeira. And all you need to do at home to taste a little bit of μονεμβασια is buy yourself a bottle of Madeira and try to consume it somewhere in a sunny place. While you are tasting the wine of ancient μονεμβασια, look around you, and you can now begin to pick out that there are more levels of civilization planted on this spot than the original Byzantine. Rising up in the town square beside the Byzantine church is a great campanile, a Venetian bell tower. The Venetians, in fact, came and captured this place and held it for many years as a bastion of their ever-expanding empire, an empire that always expanded at the expense of the Byzantines. Near that little square with its campanile and Byzantine church, you will see a mosque, a place where the Ottomans would worship when they in turn came and seized μονεμβασια for their own. This was a place desired of all nations, both for its commercial importance, its strategic strength, and the beauty of the town that those Byzantines had created. One of the adventurers who came here and for a while captured μονεμβασια was a Frankish lord whose name was Guillaume, or William, de Villehardouin. He came in the middle of the 13th century, about 1248 or 1249. And he and his men, assaulting μονεμβασια from the sea in their ships, were able to capture the town. Having captured it and being on his way to creating a little Frankish empire there in the Peloponnese, which was in those days a great land of opportunity for knights roving around in the wild east and looking for places that they could raise their banners, he continued on into the Peloponnese to another fortifiable place, a place that is called Mystra. And that is the next stop on our tour of these lost outposts of the Byzantine Empire. Mystra lies also in Laconia, that southern part of the Peloponnese where the mighty Spartans once ruled. Mystra, however, far from being a sea town, is right along the slopes of the central mountain ridge, the wonderful mountain called Taygetos. Guillaume de Villehardouin and his knights, looking for a place that they could create a castle of their own from which to rule this new domain that they hoped to build, spotted a crag on the eastern side of Mount Taygetos, just 4 miles from where ancient Sparta had been. They went up to that crag and they built a castle, one of the most extraordinary castles in all of the Aegean. We have to remember that these Frankish armies would travel not just with their knights and squires, not just with the sailors who manned their ships and took them from port to port, but with another army, an army of engineers, of masons, of architects, carpenters, people who could build for them the fortifications that they needed in order to establish bases in their newly won territories. Here at Mystra, those Frankish architects and masons wrought a marvel. It's as if we were in the south of France, or perhaps in Provence, and looking up at an incredibly high hilltop and seeing planted there one of those fantastic castles of the late Middle Ages. These masons who worked on the castle at Mystra may have, in their younger days back in France, been building cathedrals. Certainly some of the stonework looks fine enough to be in a Gothic cathedral and seems to have very little to do with the local Byzantine construction. No bricks here. Fine stonework. The stones all hauled up from an immense distance below in the valley to be placed in this beautiful Frankish castle. The castle is for the most part a shell. You can try to imagine the beautiful life that went on in this castle. Guillaume gathered around him entertainers, minstrels, men of learning, beautiful women. And for 10 years, this was one of the most flourishing and glorious courts in Europe. But then the Byzantines came back. This had been their property. They retook Monεμβασια and they captured this site. And the only way that they would agree to ransom Guillaume was if he gave up to them the cities that he had captured and the territory that he had won. Thus, this castle, after just 10 years in the hands of its Frankish builders, passed into the domain of the Byzantine emperor. It was such a wonderful spot, and now it had this fantastic castle, that the Byzantines decided to create a town on the slope below. And thus, Mystra was born. There are two ways to spell it, as is frustratingly the case with so many of our place names. Mistra is one of those ways, and I'll be saying that without the final S, but you also need to look for it as Mystras, Mystras. Below the castle, fairly far below, you will come to the remains of the Byzantine palace. And if you visit Mystra, I urge you to start at that castle, because from that lofty height, you will not only look down in a beautiful view of Byzantine Mystra spread out on the slope below, but you will have an eagle's eye view of that whole Vale of Laconia, the home territory of the Spartans, with the river Eurotas winding through its green plains down to the distant Aegean Sea. Let us descend now to that Byzantine palace, a great L-shaped structure which seems extraordinarily preserved as we approach it from some angles because it's complete right up to the level of the roof. We can see the arcades of windows, lovely details of the stonework. This is not typical Byzantine church architecture. This is mainly in stone. And it gives us an idea of the kind of palace architecture that has been lost at so many sites around that vanished Byzantine Empire. Unfortunately, when we get into this palace, we find the same situation as up in the Frankish castle. We find that the interior has been mainly destroyed and that we are looking at the shell, the evocative and beautiful shell of a once powerful and rich palace. To see the glories of Byzantium here at Mystra, it is the ecclesiastical architecture, the church architecture, that we are going to need to explore. And with the palace, we begin to enter the zone of those churches. Don't imagine that this was entirely an ecclesiastical community. Far from it. We know that late in its history, there were still 40,000 people living at Mystra. What did they do? Well, they farmed on the plain below. Mystra was their citadel where they could be up high and see enemies coming. And they had one particularly important industry that truly made them rich. In 522 AD, somebody in Byzantium somehow got hold of the eggs of silkworms. The Chinese had a monopoly on the production of silk for centuries. It had been a closely guarded secret. Many people in the West couldn't even imagine what sort of plant or animal could produce these threads of such sleekness and a cloth that took color so beautifully. But the Chinese stranglehold was broken in 522 AD, and from then on, Byzantines and outposts of the Byzantine Empire were able to produce silk. It became known, or the knowledge was brought with the eggs from the Far East, that the little worms, the silkworms, would only eat one thing: leaves of the mulberry tree. And so you need to picture the plains below you when you are at Mystra, looking out, covered with these green trees, these mulberry trees with their distinctive patterned leaves. The whole of the Peloponnese ultimately became called Morea, the mulberry leaf, either because it's shaped like a mulberry leaf or because the mulberry trees grew in such abundance at Mystra and other Byzantine sites that they gave their name to the entire land. Let's go into some of the surviving churches and the monastic foundations. And let's begin with a beautiful nunnery not too far from the palace called Pantanassa. Here the nuns lived surrounded by some of the most remarkable paintings to survive from the Byzantine age. Some Byzantine churches were covered with mosaics. Here at Pantanassa they are frescoes, that technique where the fresh wet plaster is painted and the paint is actually sealed into the plaster itself in a way that preserves it from flaking off as it would do if it were simply painted on the dry wall. We are looking at extraordinary frescoes. These are the finest preserved at Mystra here in Pantanassa, in which we begin to see a change from the Byzantine style in which fairly flat figures of iconic type are placed on a flat landscape. Here in Mystra, we not only see the rounding of the figures and the effect of strong emotion between figures in different groups, but we see extraordinary color choices, vivid bolts of color, of intense greens or yellows that seem to make the figures spring free of that background altogether. This type of art spread through the entire Aegean, including the island of Crete, where a young man who history was to know as El Greco, the Greek, was growing up at the same time that Mystra was in its last days. This is the kind of art that inspired El Greco and that he took away with him, first to Italy and then to Spain, to inject into the Western Renaissance a very strong and rich thread of the East. Near Pantanassa Nunnery is a monastery, the Brontochion. It's not so famous for its art, it's famous for one Byzantine scholar who lived there. Brontochion Monastery became a mini Renaissance of its own because of a man named George Gemistos Plathon. It was his mission in life to revive an interest in the Greek classics. The Western world had been reading Cicero and Virgil and the other Latin classics for centuries, but the Byzantine Church had disapproved, to some extent, of the Greek classics. George Gemistos Plathon was an advocate of Plato. As a man who had virtually created additional gospels, he wrote a long book about Plato and Aristotle in which he showed how Aristotle was wrong about everything and Plato was always right. The whole world got to know these two lost philosophers from his book, and he actually traveled to Italy and from his base at Mystra had a tremendous impact on the Italian Renaissance. Now, at the bottom of the hill, we're going to come to a grand church. In fact, it served as the cathedral, St. Demetrius Church. And in it we will see a remarkable plaque on the floor, white marble, bearing the double-headed eagle. That is the emblem of the Byzantine Empire. And in fact, it became the emblem, for instance, of the Romanov czars in Russia who considered themselves the heirs of the Byzantine Empire. That plaque traditionally marks the spot where the very last emperor of Byzantium was consecrated. His name was Constantine XI. He lived here at Mystra, as did so many princes of the imperial house, growing up not in distant Byzantium, but right here, a second Byzantium, out in the remote part of the empire, in this beautiful vale of Laconia, surrounded by those mulberry trees and the lovely life of this now long-vanished court. When you get to the bottom of the hill, you will find yourself in a little town. Note that even the manhole covers have the double-headed eagle on them, as if the modern population is eager to proclaim their allegiance to that long-vanished emperor far away. Today, Mystra is a ghost town, but that's not true of some other outposts of Byzantium that still survive in the world. I'm referring to the monasteries, which have carried into our own modern time an unbroken tradition, reaching back to the days when emperors and princes from Byzantium would go out and learn from the monks, meditate with them, and then leave rich bequests to those monasteries to build yet more chapels and to create yet more frescoes. A classic site for this kind of activity is Meteora, an extraordinary geological formation with an extraordinary Byzantine set of monasteries on top, up in the Pindos Mountains of northern Greece, a bit south of Mount Olympus. These sandstone towers near the town of Kalambaka were the place of refuge of monastic groups way back in the 13th century. In an unsettled time, well, what time wasn't unsettled in Greece after the fall of Rome? At any rate, the monasteries down on the plain decided that they needed to seek refuge on these high pedestals of stone, and the result is one of the most extraordinary sightings of monasteries anywhere in the world. These sandstone towers seem totally inaccessible and therefore safe from those who were marauding down on the lowlands. One by one, the monasteries, and in one case a nunnery, the nunnery of St. Barbara, moved from the plain up onto these pinnacles, in some places seemingly inaccessible from the valley floor, so that they had to haul their provisions up in baskets, and sometimes even haul people up in those baskets. In other cases, they had stair steps winding up the sides of these precipitous rocks. The greatest of these monasteries, Megalometeoro, was built with the inspiration of a saint who came down from another Byzantine monastery site, Mount Athos, to the north. And this Megalometeoro gives us the explanation of the name Meteora for this entire group of monasteries hanging in midair, because the Meteor, that's not the root as in meteor exactly, it's the same as in meteorology, the study of phenomena in the air, and Meteora does indeed mean that which is suspended in midair. Visit Meteora today, hike through the trails, climb the precipitous flights of up to 400 steps to get to those lofty perched monasteries, and you too will feel suspended in air. I'm intrigued by the fact that in our own time, I mean right now, Byzantine studies are on the rise. When I was young, it was all classical Greek and Roman. Even on archaeological sites, Byzantine material was often ignored. Now, those who study Byzantine Empire, Byzantine art are in strong demand by universities all over the world. Departments of Byzantine studies are opening, and nations that have Byzantine remains within their borders are careful to showcase those sites. And I ask myself, is it partly because our own generation at this time is beginning to feel more sympathy with the uncertain, beleaguered world of the Byzantines than it did for the classical world with so much assurance and belief in objective rationality that characterized the ancient Greeks and Romans? I would like to share with you a personal encounter that I had with the Byzantine Empire at its lonely outpost of Mount Athos in the far north of the Aegean Sea. The Mount Athos promontory extends like a finger down into the Aegean, with at its tip the soaring mass of Mount Athos itself, which climbs more than a mile high out of the Aegean and brews tremendous storms around its summit. On the slopes of Mount Athos are many ancient monasteries reaching back to Byzantine times. It was a holy mountain centuries ago and still holds that title today. Within those monasteries, the heartbeat of Byzantium still goes on. The rituals, the icons, the sense of devotion to a world and to values hidden from ordinary mortal sight. The Mount Athos communities, all strictly men. No women are allowed on that promontory, although any of us can take a boat around the edge of it. They are a combination of the communal effort and the individual meditation. I saw many of these monasteries from the sea when I was doing research on the Greek research vessel Egeo, exploring the depths around the Mount Athos Peninsula, looking for ancient shipwrecks. I remember on one occasion when I was hanging suspended off the research vessel by the big crane, sitting in the little submersible Thetis and about to dive down into the depths, looking out as from the little ball of a helicopter at the landing place on the sea where I was about to be deposited by the Navy pilot who was with me. I looked out and saw a Byzantine monk, a Greek Orthodox monk from one of the monasteries on Mount Athos, black-clad, high hat, standing up in a little boat. And I was very concerned that we had mistaken the nature of our permit and had come too close to the sacred shore of Mount Athos. but instead he made it plain that he was simply there to bless the boat, to offer an ancient word or prayer on our behalf to protect us down there in the deep. That night, I sat on the deck of the ship and looked up at Mount Athos as the lights came out in all the monasteries. Candles, lamps, and there was one little hermitage clinging to the side of a cliff, hundreds of feet from any path or access point that I could see. And I said to the friend sitting next to me, "Well, no one can be there." And even as I said that, a little lamp was lit in that window. Here was I on the deck of this ship, surrounded by all the technology of my world, by the remote sensing devices, the special underwater devices to look for ships. Here was I leading a life that went at a mile a minute, looking up at a window behind which was a man who had probably not moved from that spot for days and took a long view of eternity, a view that went back hundreds of years. And I asked myself, here are two ways. Which is truly the more enduring?